Hello and welcome back to the Polymath World channel, and we're diving into philosophy again today with one of my favourites, someone who I've had the pleasure of getting to know a bit more over the last 2 years. He's a very popular and successful philosophy writer. You may well have read his books, and if you haven't, you can get them from all good bookstores. I'm joined by Dr Julian Baggini. Thank you so much for joining me today, Julian.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Sam.
It's always a pleasure. And for those who don't know you, could you just tell us something of your career background and what it is you do?
Yeah, start with the short answer. Well, I'm basically a freelance writer. I mean, that's what I do. So that came off the back of a philosophy PhD, and then co-founding the Philosophers Magazine, which I then edited for a decade. And from that starting point, I just gradually be able to write more and more for a living. And then around the turn of the millennium, I became just a full-time freelance, and have been so ever since.
What got you into philosophy in the first place?
Well, I think it was just an interest in the big questions, with big capital letters. I didn't really know much about what philosophy was. My father, who was largely absent, had a kind of a autodidact sort of interest in philosophy, and was always going on about Plato's Republic as being like the most important book in the universe. So I'm sure he had some kind of influence. But at school, I was interested in the big issue topics. So when it came to A-level, which is senior year, I think they'd called it elsewhere, 16 to 18, I chose politics, religious studies, and English literature because they seemed to be the options I had that would, enable me to explore those. Now, I went to do philosophy and English literature at university, not really knowing what I was getting myself in for, to be honest, like a lot of people, I mean, strangely enough, I wasn't put off by the fact, I was reminded of this the other day, that I went to my school library looking for books on philosophy, and our small library had virtually nothing. It had Stephen Corner's Introduction to Kant. I couldn't make head nor tail of it, but for some reason I didn't take that as a sign that I shouldn't do philosophy.
Where did you do your PhD, and what was your thesis on?
Well, it was at University College London, and it was on personal identity. I called it footnotes to Derek Parfit, because PhDs are like that, really. They're kind of very kind of narrow. I tried to sort of like make it a little bit more expansive. I managed to get Kierkegaard into chapter 1, which I was very pleased about. But yeah, essentially it's kind of footnotes to Derek Parfit's views on personal identity, which are very much in the same tradition as John Locke and David Hume, and even Buddhist views on the self, interestingly enough, although Parfit mentions that in one page in an appendix, and that's the only connection he makes.
So where did things take you from there? Because you've mentioned before to me that you didn't sort of feel the pull of academia. Philosophy started to take you in other directions. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I decided quite late I was going to do postgraduate work. So I had a couple of years between my first degree and my second one. And even then, I just wanted to do an MPhil because I thought that a bit of unfinished business. I thought I hadn't got into it enough. And then that converted itself to a PhD. And all the time, I had no thoughts of an academic career. And I do remember quite clearly this sort of strange recognition when I realised that everybody else of my postgraduate group at UCL wanted to be academics and were starting to do the things that they needed to make that possible, like try to get papers published and things. And I realised I was the weird one, not having that ambition. I think I didn't fancy it because, first of all, you do have to be very narrow in your focus, and my interests are just broad. So I didn't really want to be pinned down in that way. Also, I think I wasn't really attracted to teaching, which may seem strange. A lot of academics say they love the teaching and they love their students. But I always felt there's the confidence about teaching. Philosophy is a subject where so much is contested. There's always so much you don't know. I was always uncomfortable about even teaching it to like school kids, which I did for a while. I found a bit tricky. I did 1 year of doing undergraduate tutorials, which graduate students did. And I found that I was in constant fear of being exposed to my ignorance by people who are probably smarter and knew more than me.
Yeah, it's imposter syndrome hits hard the further you get into, just your PhD, let alone academia.
That's true, but I think philosophy is particularly prone to it, and in a sense,
yes,
you should be prone to it. I think anyone who's really confident that they know what they're talking about in philosophy and haven't gone severely wrong on something is overconfident. You know, I remember this being said by, I think, Simon Critchley, one of the earliest philosophers I interviewed, who said, you know, if I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you know, with philosophy you're always only one step away from nonsense, and that fear that all your words could be spinning in the wind is something that you've got to be aware of in order to make it less likely that it actually becomes the truth.
Yes. So you do find yourself very good at writing, and so you made the move into journalism and writing books, and I've had the pleasure of having you speak and take part in debates at some of the schools in my area, and there's always teachers who are like, "Oh, Julian Baggini, I've read How the World Thinks. I've read The Pig That Eats Itself. You know, I've read his books. I know him." So, where did you find that you had this particular aptitude for popular philosophy and popular writing, and moving into journalism as well?
Well, that's interesting. I think I always liked writing. When I was at primary school, you know, I just liked writing stories. And in fact, I wrote stories all through until... I haven't written any fiction for years, but as a child, I always liked writing stories. And like a lot of people, I've got a little notebook, which is like a novel, which is, you know, probably about 2,500 words, but broken up into chapters and things. So I always liked writing, and I always wanted to try to do it. In terms of, I don't know if I ever realised I had a aptitude for it. I just kept trying, and I think that the only thing to my credit perhaps is that I do learn. One of the nicest things my PhD supervisor said to me, and I was her first PhD student actually, is that, you know, we would have tutorials and she'd sort of tell me, you know, where the problems were, and then when I came back I would have sorted it. And she was saying, actually, it's really, really unusual. Most of the time with your PhD students, you know, you have to have about 3 or 4 goes before they do it. But also, you know, if you want to write for a living, you have to have a certain kind of discipline, and you have to be able to meet the demands of who you're writing for, and that's so important. So, you know, getting into journalism, I think just people who used me found that I could deliver something on time, readable, etc., etc., and also just trying to be interesting. I think, you know, I write a lot. Sometimes people say to me, "You churn them out," which I take slight offence at, because it makes it sound like it's kind of mechanical. And I think, you know, no matter what I'm writing, I always try to make sure that it isn't just mechanical. In fact, it's one thing that I've noticed as a quality that I dislike in some people who are otherwise very, very good at writing for popular audiences, which is you don't get that feeling of thought in action in the writing. You get the feeling that this is someone who knows a lot, who has their views and can communicate well, so they're just putting it down on paper again. I like to think that if you're going to read someone on anything that requires some thought, you get some sense that thought has gone into it. They're not just regurgitating their views for the upteenth time.
And you do have a tremendous gift for explaining things, and it's interesting. We've had Stephen Law on this channel as well, and we were talking about the particular challenge of communicating philosophy to a broad audience. I think it's actually harder than science communication, communicating philosophy for a broad audience. What was it that made you want to take up that challenge, and how have you enjoyed it?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it might sound strange, but I don't think my main interest was in communication as such. My main interest was, again, having that broad interest in philosophy rather than the narrow one. So I never sort of think I'm just explaining something to somebody. If I'm writing about something, it's usually because I'm just a process of trying to understand it myself a bit better, you know. So that's what it's really about, and then it's just doing it in really clear ways. So with the Philosophers Magazine, I had a really clear kind of vision for what it should be, which is that, you know, it should be like proper philosophy, and you should be able to read it whether you know nothing about philosophy or whether you know a lot about philosophy. If you knew a lot about philosophy, you would learn things, because people tend to know not a lot outside their own specialism. So you could read an article on an aspect of philosophy you don't know and learn something from it. And the only thing was it had to be written in a way that any intelligent, well-informed person could understand. And you say it's difficult, but in some ways it's not as difficult as people think. It mainly, what it requires is an element of self-awareness that a lot of people don't have. So people seem to be remarkably poor at not recognising the things that they know that other people might not. So an obvious thing is jargon. You have to avoid using jargon. But I found over the years it's a running joke that philosophers don't really know where jargon starts. So I always say to people if they're giving a talk, and by the way, epistemology and normative, these are jargon. Don't say epistemology and normative unless you explain what they mean. Because if I don't say that, 9 times out of 10, they'll throw those words in, epistemic this and all of that.
Yes.
And so if as long as you're kind of aware that you just have to bear in mind all the time, the reader may know nothing about this. So explain it in a way that makes sense to them. That's not as difficult as it seems. I think making it interesting, making it engaging is a little bit more difficult, I think, and I'm not sure I know how to explain how to do that.
You've mentioned a few times about being broad, even though PhDs are always sort of narrow. You yourself have been broad, and you've written books on a number of different topics. Would you say you have any particular philosophical interests that you're naturally drawn to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I mean, one of the things that I have been interested in is actually the nature of rationality itself, which is, so they're meta-philosophical issues we call them, the philosophy or philosophy, what it means to think well. That really does interest me, and I was very lucky with that because I'd written bits and pieces over the years about it, and I wanted to write a book about it, and I felt that it probably was going to be a hard sell for the kind of more commercial market, but I managed to persuade Yale University Press to take on that book. It's called The Edge of Reason, and it's one of those projects, it's the most personal book I've written, I think, in the sense that it's the one which is most about my own views. I mean, I think my own views aren't generally very important or interesting. I'm mainly explaining other people's views, and of course I have my take on which ones I think are right and wrong, but I'm not so much interested in that, in what I think. With The Edge of Reason, again, I think there's probably, if you analyse it, there may be nothing completely original at all, but it has more of my kind of spin on it and my angle on it than others. So that nature of rationality very much interests me, particularly because it relates to other issues as well, because we've sort of come into contact around religion, atheism, etc., etc. And I find it really interesting that evidently intelligent, rational people are religious believers, which I'm not. And a lot of people who are atheists sort of just think this is just plainly irrational, it's a failure of reason, it's a local blind spot. And so I think one's got to understand how one can be rational in a way without and come to very, very different views about this. And one of the things that is important about that is when we say someone's not being rational, I think there's a little ambiguity in that. Sometimes we mean they're not being rational, meaning that they're wrong, they're incorrect, they've come to the wrong conclusions. But there's another sense in which someone's being rational. You can be rational, employ rational processes, and come to the wrong conclusion, right? So I think we should really call, if you're an atheist and you don't think that religious belief is rationally justified, you shouldn't call religious believers, say they're not being rational. They are being rational, but they're not coming to conclusions that you think stand up to the scrutiny of reason, which is a different thing.
What was your first book?
Well, that's quite complicated because I've done lots of things, co-authoring and co-editing and so forth.
Right.
But the first book that was really, and I think probably the first book under my own name was like a pair of textbooks, which was Philosophy, Key Texts and Key Themes. I think they're both out of print now.
Were they for high school students or university?
They were basically aimed at that A-level market. And I'd been teaching those things, so they came out of the notes and handouts that I'd written for the students. So it's quite interesting to do that. But the first book, proper book as it were, and a trade book, trade book meaning aimed at the general bookshop, was a book called Making Sense, Philosophy Behind the Headlines. It's funny to look back on that book actually, because it had an interesting history. A first iteration of it I took to a publisher who was at a fairly big publisher, was interested, had various meetings with him, and he was very keen. And then it was a kind of publisher whereby, at the end of the day, the final decision was by the head honcho. The head honcho said no, and it was dead in the water. And then I sort of hawked it around. I tried to get an agent, and like everyone, I have these stories of I've collected the rejection letters, but one person said yes. And it was the version that came out was quite reworked. And I think even now, if I look back on it, I'd probably find it. One thing I think I've tried to get away from is the idea, like I said earlier, actually, this idea of here's me explaining to you how philosophy is helpful for your world, kind of thing. Here's what to do. I mean, in a way, I'm always doing that, but I think there's this. There's always this. What you want to avoid is any sense that you're kind of offering things on a plate, that it's kind of, I'm just applying my philosophy and it's the end of the story. And I think if I look back on that book, in some ways, I hopefully a lot of it sort of stands up. It does help people to think a little bit about the philosophical issues behind the headlines of the day. But I think to my current frame of mind, I'd probably find it a little bit too, I don't know, pat something a little bit too straightforward, not sharing enough of the complexity and the difficulty for the reader, maybe. I don't know. I haven't read it for 25 years. So I don't know.
These things are always so interesting in retrospect, and I wonder if this means we won't be getting a second edition.
Well, I have thought about that, because in a sense it merits a second edition, because the idea is, it's as relevant today as ever.
Yes.
And the examples would be updated and all of that. But I think I would do it in a slightly different way. That's all. It's quite subtle, really. But it's also about what's interesting as well. I think in a sense, when that book came out, there probably wasn't a book like it. And now there are lots of people who are saying, look at what Trump's doing, and what he talks about free speech and what free speech really means. And they're basically using current affairs as kind of a hook to give a little primer on a subject, and then usually with some implication of how it should play out in that context. And I'm more interested in how. I think one thing that's maybe would be different is I think when you get into real world issues, what you normally find is there's something about the specificity of them which messes with any straightforward attempt to interpret them with off-the-shelf philosophical views, right? And in fact, I am aware of that in the sense that I think the chapter I did on the Iraq War, first Gulf War, I think it's the first one. In hindsight, I think that was a mistake I made there, because I was talking about just war theory and how it applies there. And I think the issue was that the way I was thinking about it at the time was I was doing this very typical thing of like saying, well, it's much more complicated than people are saying. And, most of my peers were just straightforwardly against the war. And I was saying, well, it's more complicated than that, a lot of hand-wringing. You could see the justifications here and there. You could also see that a lot of the arguments against the war were a bit simplistic. They weren't taking into account the nuance. But actually, at the end of the day, what that meant was I don't think I endorsed the war, but I certainly didn't go against it. And I think that, from my perspective now, I think, look, you've got all that theory, but then look at the specificity of it. At the time, it should have been quite obvious that what was going on, facts on the ground, this couldn't possibly have ended well. And that's not a philosophical argument as such, right? It relates to the philosophical arguments. But, I think it's important to always sort of have that awareness that, and I think it's what I was saying earlier about what I'm slightly uncomfortable about the way I approached the whole book. I suspect if I went back, I'd find I was like applying these philosophical principles without paying enough attention to the specificity of what was actually going on. And that's why I think, again, it gets to my view that philosophy is not kind of a tool you apply to the world. It's a tool alongside others. It helps you to think about things, but you have to get really engaged with whatever it is you're thinking about, and not just think you can come in with the philosophical parachute regiment to come in, sort it out, and leave again.
I really enjoyed How the World Thinks, and I love that you followed that up with a book called How the World Eats, because These are great titles in a Waterstones or Blackwell's bookshop that you can walk past and think, yeah, that's a great book for the train or the plane, as well as for people who are really interested in philosophy anyway. But actually, the first book of yours that I read was your very short introduction to atheism.
Oh, right. Okay. Yep.
And this is something that you're known for. What was it that brought you to sort of hone your skills and set your sights on philosophy of religion?
Well, again, it really wasn't. I mean, philosophy of religion, most philosophy of religion as taught, certainly in schools, and even undergraduate, I didn't find that interesting. You know, I got very bored with it. Well, these arguments for the existence of God, I just felt were, I mean, first of all, I think they're just obviously not very good, but also besides the point, because I've met very few people who believe in God because they're persuaded by the ontological argument or the cosmological argument.
Yes,
although strangely enough, the person who wrote a book called Philosophy for Dummies, which was on the record of saying probably the worst introduction to philosophy I have ever read, did claim that Pascal's wager made him sort of like turn to religion, which I thought was interesting.
Huh.
But it was simply the case that I was quite active in, well, not that active, I'm telling a lie. We had the Humanist Society, as it was then called, had a Humanist Philosophers group, and we met and we wrote a pamphlet on religious schools and a few things like this. And I think it kind of came out of that. And also in terms of the journalism, you know, there were always religious issues around that invited some kind of commentary from an atheist perspective. And also, it predated the God delusion, actually. That's quite interesting. I kind of forget that. So it was just a combination of factors. I think the point is, though, that I haven't been... I think the thing that most motivated me, though, was I felt that I kept hearing these same old sort of arguments against atheism and atheists, which I thought were really very, very hollow. And so there's a certain frustration, you know. So these sort of stock things people say about atheism, well, how can you prove that God doesn't exist? Well, it's not about certainty, that's the whole point, you know. You're confusing being a dogmatic atheist with being an atheist, you know, and simply why aren't you an agnostic? And then, yeah, but how can you have any moral values without... So these things, they're very tired things, and I just wanted to sort of write something short that would at least address those things and show that, okay, you may not agree, but it's certainly not as simple as people think it is.
Yes, and that's drawn you into opportunities to debate, and I know you were the keynote speaker at the Humanists UK conference last year, I believe. Was it? Yeah, 2024. But yes, but you weren't a particular fan of some of the arguments in New Atheism either. Sort of atheism kind of became something in the popular sphere that didn't really resonate with you.
Yeah, no, a bit frustrating really, in the sense that I was like, in a very short introduction to philosophy, I'm making this distinction between dogmatic atheism and sort of reasonable atheism, all this kind of stuff, and how, you know, I was very frustrated that atheists are being caricatured as these bishop-bashing maniacs, and then we had the new atheism and we had the bishop-bashing maniacs. Well, not quite, but that was certainly the way it came over a lot, you know. You know, I think calling your book The God Delusion is good for sales, but delusion is not a title which is designed to kind of be sympathetic to the people you're sort of writing about. and the new atheism did sort of unleash that quite harsh anti-religious version of atheism, whereas I think, you know, to be an atheist you don't have to be particularly anti-religion. I mean, I'm not really anti-religion, I am anti-forms of belief that are dogmatic and harmful, of which I would include a great deal of religion, unfortunately, a certain fraction of atheism, certainly things like Stalinism, Maoism, Putinism, communism, etc., etc. And so these are the enemies. So one of the sort of things I've written about time and again is, I've used this phrase, the sort of coalition of the reasonable. I mean, the people I think have the most in common are not divided on whether they believe in God or not. It's whether they are committed to a certain non-dogmatic and open-minded stance in which we allow for pluralism of views. And so from that point of view, I have more in common with that kind of religious believer than I do with the kind of atheist who says, and I've had people say this to me, that they imagine one day religious belief will be treated as a mental illness is treated. I mean, that is not representative of most atheists, but there are atheists out there who think that, and I find them as scary as like jihadists. Not
Yes.
quite as scary. No, not quite
Maybe,
as scary. Actually,
yeah, not to
because
the
they're
point of
not
death.
actually claiming. They're not actually going to go out and kill, but as intellectually frustrating. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I've really appreciated your efforts and your manner in trying to improve the conversation. I think in the immediate aftermath of the first wave of new atheism, you did have a lot of high school teenagers who were wanting to be the next Christopher Hitchens and sort of copying a lot of the God delusion style of discussion, and it wasn't very conducive with reasonable discussion or critical thinking. It was quite snarky. That's the best word I can think of for it.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I mean, it's interesting, in terms of this factional stuff. I did get a bit of flack at least once. I wrote a piece once, which was like criticising the new atheist sort of approach. It was given an unhelpfully dramatic headline, I think, which didn't help. But there were these sort of websites, discussion boards, which were very much sort of based around Dawkins, and they were sort of really sort of laying into it. And there's this sort of, I think Dawkins himself, he's a very interesting character, because actually, if you ever sort of speak to him and everything, he's very mild mannered and all that kind of stuff. But he seems to have a knack of saying and writing things which can only be seen as intemperate. And he had the idea of the fleas. The dog attracts the fleas, and so anyone who kind of as it were, goes behind Dawkins and criticise him, you're called one of Dawkins's fleas, and I think people should be aware of that kind of language. It's like the vermin and the lice and the cockroaches in Miranda. People should be more sensible to us. You don't use dehumanising language to describe your opponents, and yet people were doing that on this site. I think that was extremely disappointing.
Yes, it's not very winsome. There's the thing where you can win the debate but lose the person, which is good for nothing. On this topic, let's talk about critical thinking a little bit, and how you can use philosophy to help people think critically, and the importance of that. In your work, both for young people, but in your popular writing, this is something you try and encourage. How can professional philosophers and academic philosophers help encourage critical thinking in the world?
Yeah, well, the short answer is by not being too narrowly philosophical. So I wrote the book How to Think Like a Philosopher, which was but part of the answer to that is don't think just like a philosopher, because I think that one of the things that I've become a bit disillusioned with from quite early on. It was quite striking how philosophers could be quite stupid, like everybody can. I'm not saying that especially. It's very easy, but I think there's a particular problem with philosophy, because philosophers have the self-image of themselves as the kings and queens of critical thinking. So they often assume that they know how to think about anything in a way that other people don't. And that means they blunder in with their sort of like, list of fallacies and deductive inferences and all that kind of stuff. And they don't understand, going back to what I was saying earlier, about how the specificity of what you're talking about makes a difference. So I've got my stock example of this is the guy who objected when the Andrew Wakefield thing, he wrote, this is a person who wrote the notorious paper linking the measles, mumps and rubella MMR vaccine with autism, I think. And
yes, yeah.
Totally debunked, and it turned out that the funding of that was very dubious, because it was funded largely by people who were anti-vaccine campaigners. When that was discovered, the editor of the journal, which was The Lancet, which published it, said had he known that, he would not have published it. Mm-hmm. And a philosopher, not in a big public way, but in public, says, yes, but there's this thing which is known as the genetic fallacy, which is that arguments should be assessed on their merits, and where they come from is irrelevant. So the fact that if a Nazi makes an argument, that doesn't mean it's a bad argument. You have to show why the argument is wrong. You can't dismiss it because it was a Nazi. So this is coming in there with this knowledge of the genetic fallacy and how arguments must stand and fall, completely ignoring the really important psychological and sociological fact that there is such a thing called motivated reasoning. And there's a very good reason why in science you have to declare your interest, and why it's not a good idea. People who have a vested interest in the result of an outcome should not be the primary funders of it. And so that's the kind of thing they do all the time. So when it comes to how philosophy can help with critical thinking, I think it can, but it has to do so when it comes in with a certain modesty and recognises the fact that its tools have to be used alongside other tools. Otherwise it's kind of disastrous, I think.
Yes, absolutely. That's very well put. Another thing I'd love to ask you about in terms of your writing is free will. You threw your hat into the free will book arena. Could you just tell us why you chose to write your book on free will, and just sort of summarize your position, particularly given Sam Harris and other people have written popularly on this?
No, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, in terms of my sort of going back to the career thing, in the early days I was just amazed that I was being published and I could be published. And I think I reached a certain stage into the career when I realised that I ought to. You can only write so many books, and I wanted to make sure I was going to write the ones that I really wanted to write. And the one I'd really wanted to write was the one which sort of came out of a PhD about personal identity, the ego trick. And I reached a point where I could do that. But very different from the PhD. It took the personal identity issue and looked at it much more broadly. And the point was, free will was kind of it's the other side of the same coin in a way. It's kind of, you're going to talk about personal identity, who you are, etc. And the question of, well, yes, but is there a free self there at all? Is like it was the unanswered question raised by that book. And I wanted to write it because, again, well, partly because, again, I kind of did know roughly where I stood on this debate, but I didn't have it fully thought out. And the other thing that interested me was I did think that we talk about free will in philosophy in a way which is artificially kind of narrow. If you ask people what it means to be free, then they don't necessarily have this kind of definition which is a starting point in philosophy, which is the capacity to have done other than you actually did. And the other interesting thing is that free will debate is also historically and geographically a local one too. It's not one the ancient Greeks had, and so forth. So I wanted to kind of not just sort of like do a kind of primer on compatibilism and why it's true. Compatibilism being the view that, it is possible to believe both that everything happens as a result of a causal chain and we have a meaningful version of free will. But to sort of zoom back a bit, really, and I said, well, what do we really mean by freedom? And in fact, on that score, I mean, you talk about the other books. I think the best other book on free will around was Dan Dennett's first one called Elbow Room, and the subtitle of that was The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. And I thought, what's so good about that book was that he thought, before we can talk about do we have free will, we have to think of all the different things free will could mean, and then try and work out which are the ones that have any value and whether we have those. And I thought that whole approach was exactly the right one. And I think he did his book very well, but mine was a different kind of thing altogether.
Yeah, I love that, and I encourage people to go and find it and really try and pin down where they fit in this discussion of free will. Obviously, it's a massive topic and something that has massive implications.
It's still the one which I think is trickiest, I mean, I've written the book and everything, but I still find it somewhat slippery. I think it is very difficult, because I think the point is there is a sense in which we are not free in a fairly deep sense. And hanging on to the idea but that doesn't matter for most of what we want out of free will is important. But I think that the ways in which we are more fundamentally not free, if you like, they do have implications for how we treat wrongdoers, etc., etc. So I think in the end up you've got this situation where, it's a very, very delicate balance. human beings have a sufficient degree of autonomy and agency that holding them responsible for what they do is both necessary and justified, but not completely. Because again, I think one of the key things in the book is when people talk about responsibility, and it's the absolutism. No one is absolutely responsible for what they do, right? But you don't have to be absolutely responsible. You have to be responsible enough, right? Responsible enough means you're responsive to reasons, you have a certain degree of self-control that you can do something different about it. And it's by treating people in this way that those faculties get strengthened. If you don't treat people in that way, it doesn't work. But because the bottom line is, at any particular moment in time, I think it's true that you are going to do what you did at that moment. There's no repeating that. It means that there is a sort of limit to how much you can blame people and hold people responsible. And so ultimately there is a need for a kind of compassion and understanding there. But it's a difficult balance. I don't think you can provide an algorithm for this. How harsh should the criminal justice system be? If it's too harsh, it's holding people to account for things that they really could not have done otherwise in any reasonable life, which seems unfair. If it's too lenient, then what you're doing is you're not, as it were, getting people to take the responsibility they need, to use that muscle. So responsibility is as much something we take as we just have. We don't just simply have it. We have to take it and learn to take it, and that's something society does. It's a very, very difficult balance. And when people complain that it's slippery, I kind of get the point. But I think the point is that too many people want things to be clear cut, and they think if it's not clear cut, there's something wrong with it, right? I would rather have, I think, a truthful, somewhat messy, somewhat unclear understanding of what free will is, and have a neat solution that says we either just don't have it or we absolutely have it. But that solution to me is just sort of like avoiding all the real complexity and uncertainty there is in the world. Yeah,
I agree. I completely agree. It's a great topic, in particular for opening up with young people. I like running those sorts of debates and discussions in high schools. I think it really gets people thinking and gets people interested in philosophy as well. It's a great topic for that.
Actually, one of the most, I did some very interesting interviews for that book. I interviewed a woman, Gwen Adsaid, who worked at Dartmoor, which was a hospital for they don't say criminally insane anymore, but people who are basically deemed to have not be criminally responsible because of their mental condition and everything. And again, she's really fascinating, got a very nuanced position on this. And actually once, I've only once in my life have I done a session in a prison, and I ought to do it more. And we did free will in a prison, and I kind of imagined that maybe a lot of these prisoners would be very tempted towards views that diminished their sense of responsibility. And it was the exact opposite, actually.
Wow.
They were very sort of like keen not to avoid responsibility for what they'd done, even though they could easily have pointed to life circumstances, chaotic stuff, etc., etc. It's like being in prison and everything had in some ways made them realise that they can make all the excuses they want, but at the end of the day, if they don't take responsibility for what they do, well, they're just going to be back and back again, and it's not going to work.
That's very interesting. What future projects are you involved with, or future books are you writing?
Well, I'm working at the moment on something around overcoming polarized thinking, which obviously is extremely topical.
Wow.
It is. It's a difficult one in lots of ways, because we have to get beyond platitudes on this, because everyone thinks that polarized thinking is wrong and binary thinking is wrong and things aren't black and white. But actually, if you try and drill down as to how you do that in practice in a way that you don't just end up with a kind of a sludge or a shrug of the shoulders or uncertainty, it's very, very difficult. So that's really interesting. And I've obviously got various sort of issues and things I'm focusing on as kind of case studies. So hope to see. It's the kind of thing that I'm not looking for controversy, but I think if you think of some of the more divisory issues around at the moment, if you try and I want to try and write about those, not to advance a particular answer, but to try and understand why they're so polarizing and if we can possibly overcome them. It's hard to do that without putting the backs up of some people at least. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, I'll look forward to that one. If people want to find out more about you or find your writing, where should they go?
Well, I've got a website which is very imaginatively called julianbaggini.com. There's a newsletter you can sign up for, and I have to say the newsletter is... I aspire to do it monthly, and I think last year I did 5 or maybe 6. So your inbox will not be overwhelmed. That's really the only decent way to do it, because I've kind of withdrawn a lot from social media now. I really have. I passively post things on Facebook to say what I've published. I actually don't go on to Facebook. It's a third-party thing which just puts things there, and I don't really engage with it. I'm on Instagram, but not really doing much, mainly following local Bristol food people. So yeah, it's really that newsletter, which, as I say, it's not going to clog up your inbox. Don't worry.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you today. Always a pleasure to talk philosophy with you, and thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks, Sam. It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more amazing conversations with incredible researchers who are changing the world we live in and driving humanity forward. Feel free to check out my Instagram at polymath_Sam, or go to my website at www.sam-mckee.co.uk.